Hello, everyone. Welcome, listeners, to a new episode of the Latam Monitor Podcast. I am your host, Fernando Prats, Program Director at London Political's Latin America program. And as usual, I'm joined by Carlos Cruz Infante, affiliate to the Latin America program at London Politica, and who also serves as country manager for Peru and Chile at Cefeidas Group. Today, we have a very special episode as Juan Cruz Díaz is joining us. Juan Cruz is managing director at Cefeidas Group, an international advisory firm specializing in political risk advisory and corporate governance. He's also a special advisor to the American Society Young Council of the Americas and co-directs the corporate governance program at Universidad de San Andrés in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He has also worked advising international organizations like the Organization of American States and the World Bank, and holds a master's degree from Tufts University. So welcome, Juan Cruz. Welcome, Carlos. Thank you very much for your time and for being here with us. I hope you're having a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Carlos, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Okay, so Juan Cruz, let me start by asking you a broad question to start getting listeners into South American political and business environment dynamics. So, how do you currently see South America in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape? How do you see its role? How do you see its position? And especially, how do you foresee the region in the years coming and throughout the next decade?
Well, it's a great question and a broad one. We of course we have, as a region in South America, we have a huge advantage. Although we have a lot of personal security issues and violence and several problems associated with drug trafficking and other several problems that our countries are facing. South America is a region of peace. We don't have internal wars among countries in the region, and it's overall a region of peace, and that gives us a huge advantage as a region. But we're quite isolated from the biggest geopolitical threats that we're seeing in the world. We're far away from the Ukraine. We're far away from the Middle East, although very close to here, actually, where I'm speaking. We had a huge impacts from the crisis in the Middle East of terrorism coming from the Middle East, but we're far from the war zone currently in the Middle East. We're very far away from other conflicts that we're seeing in Africa or in Asia and others. So overall, we're relatively isolated from the current big geopolitical threats or wars that we're seeing, and in a way that's also an advantage. But being far away and being outside of the radar from the more complicated geopolitical threats and conflicts in the world, also give us, relatively speaking, less of a say in that sense. Our impact in the geopolitical dynamics also is quite limited. Of course, some countries like Argentina and Brazil are part of the G20. Countries like Chile and Colombia have developed in recent decades a huge international presence in international organizations and multinational forums. In the trade side, countries like Chile are certainly leaders in the world. We're seeing in the next few weeks our APEC summit in Peru. So most of the world leaders will be there, and later in Brazil in the G20. So that we are participating in international forums, but as a region as a whole, we are not having an amazing impact in the geopolitical conversation there. And of course, there are a lot of explanations. I like always the saying that, for every complex problem, there's a simple a question, there's a simple answer, and that's often wrong. But certainly, the moment that we are right now here, in which um, um, we have been seeing less a stable political process in many countries on the regions. We have been dramatic switch in not only in the ideologies but policy direction of countries, and that eventually affects the dynamics, the environment, the institutions, and so on. So we've seen quite of those movements in countries, even in countries that were relatively stable decades before, like Chile or or even Colombia, for just to mention a number, and not to say Brazil or Argentina, that have switched the ideological or the policy direction quite dramatically. So that in a way, I think, affects the stability overall. We're seeing rising political instability in some of our countries, and a lot of newcomers as leaders of the countries. We've seen Gabriel Boric in Chile, Javier Milei in Argentina, Novoa in Ecuador, just to mention a few. So we've seen also a relatively weak um, regional leadership. You cannot find a clear regional leader. So and also, I think that affects as well the presence of the region. And the other thing is, there is a less of we don't have a common agenda so clear. A few years ago, you can find some commonalities either to the left or to the right, and a common agenda that would present the region as a more cohesive force to discuss in international forums. Right now, we've seen less of that. We'll see a lot of diverse ideas, and certainly the regional forums are struggling to get a sense of common vision for the region. So I would say that there are highs and lows in terms of being so far away or so isolated of those regional process. But in general, that's the picture I see.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great. As you said, we have very little impact at a global level, and we struggle also to attract investors. I mean, if you see all the emerging economies like India, the southeast of Asia, even Africa, for that count, they are successfully attracting more investors and more big scale or large scale businesses. What do you think, from a UK and a European perspective, are the most overlooked risks and opportunities? Let's stay in the big picture here, right? For those that are not familiar with the region.
It's an interesting question, because we're in a region full of opportunity. If we look at the region as a whole, we have the energy that the world needs. We have the critical minerals that the world needs. Even thinking in a world that will favor the energy transition, even in a world that would favor achieving the decarbonization goals that countries and companies are prioritizing or were prioritizing. We have those, not one country, but many of our countries. In the mining sector, in the oil and gas sector, in the renewables, we have really developed countries with a lot of potential on that. We had the resources to feed the world. Many of our countries are agricultural powerhouses. Um, we have the Amazon, and that's not only Brazil. We have you know vast resources in our sea, in the oceans. Certainly, land, sea, mountains. It's a land with huge opportunity, and we do have some investments in that sector. If you look at the Peruvian economy, and despite the huge political instability that we've seen in the last few years, I'm even losing account of how many presidents Peru has had in the last 10 years. I believe that 6, for example.
Yeah.
But despite what it would be seen as a huge political instability, the performance of Peru has been surprising in that sense, and you've seen a lot of course, there are problems and seasons in which things gets more complicated than others. But I think a robust activity in some critical sectors in Peru. The same with Chile. Chile is one of the most efficient and productive countries in the mining sector, with many global leaders working in investing. We can discuss if what's the trend of their things that we need to improve, but certainly Chile has been quite receptive of that. It's probably the country with the most free trade agreements in the world. It's an open country, friendly with investors. Brazil, of course, is an economic giant because of its size, and of course, with a lot of potential in energy, in forestry, and many other sectors. Countries that were before overlooked by investors are now getting some attention, like Paraguay. Paraguay has been doing a very interesting job in working in its economic stability and improving its business environment, and they have been very effective in the last few years, not only for UK or European or US investors, but we're seeing a lot of multi-Latinas or Latin American investors looking for opportunities in Paraguay as well. Uruguay has been a source of stability, in the region for a long time, and has received interesting developments, especially in the tech sector, for example. And of course, Argentina, it's a country that has been struggling through different political and economic crises in the last several decades, and that has hindered the possibility of achieving its full potential. But I think in a way, many of these things are connected to what I had said before. We've been going through, more or less, as a region, through a democratic transition in the last few decades, and we've been, in some cases, struggling to consolidate our democracies, and we have done that, probably with the exception of the crisis in Venezuela, which is something that the region should and must work together in solving. But this is mostly, with the exception of Venezuela, a region also in which South America has democratic institutions. And I think there are a lot of things that we have achieved as a region. But I think the political instability that had led to, together with the economic cyclical economic crisis, had led to some institutional weakness that has affected the perception of our business environment as a whole, to receive those investments. But at the same time, I think that's the opportunity. I think if you have an investor that is sophisticated enough, and is smart enough to get the right resources at a local level, get good partners, get good sources, understanding the dynamics and understanding the local dynamic, that makes a huge difference. Many of the global investors are investing in regions that are more dangerous than Latin America. They're investing in countries close to war zones, civil wars, huge political instabilities, and they know how to navigate those. And I think there's a huge opportunity for investors in Latin America if they understand how to operate that and operate in the region. And I think that's a challenge, but that's opportunity.
Sure. Thank you, Juan Cruz. Of course, you have mentioned some of it in your last answer, but we wanted to listen to you and to tell our listeners a little bit more about your firm, Cefeidas Group, and specifically how you have recently expanded operations into Chile and Peru, which are sort of two new countries for you. So, of course, you have talked about the opportunities in these two countries, but could you tell us a bit more about what drove this decision, and specifically what potential do you see in these countries from an economic standpoint, especially, of course, thinking about these foreign investors?
I think, well, part of the answer, it's connected to all the things that I just said before. I think I returned to Argentina 15 years ago, and we decided to found Cefeidas Group, always with an ambition of working regionally. I think we've always seen the opportunity of the region. We always believed that we can help investors to operate in the region, to understand the region and deploy their business strategies and their businesses in the region. That has been our aim, and that's what we've been working all these years. And of course, we've been looking at Chile and Peru very closely for a long time. We have worked there. We understand the dynamics, and we had that ambition to expand the business there, and we were waiting for the right opportunity. I think we're seeing a lot of opportunities there, and of course there are a lot of things happening. Chile has gone through a huge process, which I like to see that as an optimistic way. Chile has been going through a lot and has managed to solve that huge tension in an institutional and democratic way, which is an example of how to deal with that. Of course, there are a lot of challenges and challenges ahead. And I was talking about Peru before. Peru, with all this political instability, has managed to create a sense of macro stability and a business environment in which some of the investors were operating and even developing what things like other industries that has been quite interesting to see in Peru. So we were waiting for the right moment. We were waiting for the right people to do it. And in the last few months, we decided to do the next step. We found Carlos, and we were quite interested in his vision, in his experience, and in his leadership to help us deploy this. So we're very looking forward to what's next with this.
No pressure then. Many thanks for your really kind words, Juan. What do you think are the most challenging regulatory hurdles in these countries in particular. You've talked about Paraguay, Brazil, that it's like a unique universe within the region, right? But you know well all the southern corn, you know well the Andean countries. So what are the trends that your team has seen in the last, let's say, year, in any sector in particular? Yeah.
I think it's each case is different. I think each country has its own characteristic and its own problems. Argentina, of course, is dealing with, as you know, we've been in the last several decades, Argentina has been struggling between debt crises and an inflation crisis. And in the last few years, we have the perfect storm. So where Argentina is dealing with a combination of an inflationary crisis and a debt crisis, and a change of regime, basically, that it's way different from what we've seen in the last several decades. So Argentina is having a lot of issues, but when you talk to investors, they see the opportunity. And so far, I would say that the number one issue that investors are worried about Argentina, and the main question that we have, is the FX restrictions, the ability for investors to access to dollars, either to send dividends back home, to pay for imports, to pay for financing. And despite having regimes like the new investment regime promotion that was approved by Congress with the initiative of President Milei, despite having some assurances that you will get access to those dollars, until the restriction is removed, I think the investors are not going to be 100% at ease at investing in Argentina. So that's why I think that should be a priority. In Chile, I think, of course, a lot of things have happened in the last few years. There's a lot of questions about the elections next year. I think to get the sense of what will be the direction of the country, I think is the number one question. And in the last, few months, and Carlos knows this, that we've been hearing a lot of frustration with some investors and companies operating in Chile in terms of all the permits and the bureaucracy over the permits for several things. I think that has been probably the number one obsession of investors, foreign investors in Chile in the last couple of years. I think in other countries like Uruguay, which is a lot of stability, there are some concerns in terms of what will be the results of the election right now, to understand what will be the direction. But you won't expect many changes. But there are some concerns in terms of personal security, like in Chile, that might affect some of the business environment. But each country, I think, is different. Of course, Peru, the big question of the political stability, I think that has been around. I mean, at some point, although the macro situation and the numbers have been good, despite the political instability, that affects the confidence and affects eventually the performance on the country. So I think each country has its own aspects. Despite Paraguay, having a cheap investment grade, but one of the rating agencies, and having a team and a government that has been quite open to discuss with businesses, there are structural problems in the Paraguayan economy that are still are of concern, and of course, still some issues with the U.S. in terms of the situation of former President Cortés under influence of the current administration. Those questions are floating around, and I think our job has been, of course, talking to investors and helping them understand the environment, the unique situations in each country, and helping them develop and implementing a strategy that would be that will help them to advance their interest in each country. But I think overall each country has its own characteristics.
Well, Juan Cruz, I would really enjoy, and I would love to keep on talking for 2 or 3 more hours into every country, its risks, opportunities, challenges. But as we have agreed, we are reaching to the end of the episode. So I would like to thank you again very much for being here with us. It's been great. Very enriching and very enlightening. I'm sure it will be very informative to our audience. So thank you very much. And thank you, of course, Carlos, as always, for the great performance of the episode.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Carlos. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, so thank you, listeners, for listening to us, for watching us. As usual, we'll be meeting soon in the next episode, the next edition of the Latin America Monitor Podcast, Latin America Programs Podcast, where you will find everything on Latin American politics, economics, business environments, and geopolitics in general. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.